The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 5. The argument from the principle of identity. Premise 1. Each entity is identical to itself. According to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the law of identity, which he expresses as everything is what it is the first primitive truth of reason, which is affirmative. He stated, the statement that a thing is what it is prior to the statement that it is not another thing. Premise 2. Each entity is equal to the sum total of its constituent parts. The mereological sum principle states that the whole is identical to the sum of its parts. Premise 3. If the constituent parts of two entities are the same, the two entities themselves are the same. Leibniz's law states that if two objects have all the same properties, they are in fact one and the same. Premise 4. Beliefs are propositional states that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. A number of philosophers have suggested that the content of one's beliefs depends entirely on things going on inside one's head and not at all on the external world except via the effects of the latter on one's brain. Consequently, if a genius neuroscientist were to create a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of your brain and maintain it in a vat, stimulating it artificially so it underwent exactly the same sequence of electrical and chemical events as your actual brain, that brain would have exactly the same beliefs as you. Conclusion. Therefore, if the neural activity that constitutes non-belief is the same as the neural activity that constitutes disbelief, then these doxastic positions are the same. Premise 5. The neural activity that constitutes non-belief is indistinguishable from the neural activity that constitutes disbelief. A distinction in the neural activity that corresponds to non-belief and the neural activity that corresponds to disbelief or belief in the negation has not been substantiated, nor has any independently verifiable means to distinguish between them been provided. This is a distinction without a difference fallacy. A distinction in the concepts does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the concepts refer. This is a reification fallacy. A distinction in the words does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the terms refer. This is a lexical fallacy. A distinction in the definitions does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the concepts refer. This is an appeal to definition fallacy. A distinction in the descriptions does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the concepts refer. This is a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Conclusion 2. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that the doxastic position of non-belief is the same as the doxastic position of disbelief. Despite acknowledging the conceptual and linguistic distinction between non-belief and disbelief, the only thing that ultimately matters is whether or not these distinctions actually manifest in reality. Otherwise, we are left with a distinction without a difference fallacy.
The argument under consideration attempts to establish that it is reasonable to assume that non-belief and disbelief are the same doxastic state based on supposed neural indistinguishability. However, upon closer examination, the argument suffers from structural weaknesses. The first three premises serve no meaningful function, other than decorative. The fourth premise asserts a controversial stance without justification, and the fifth premise contradicts the fourth while failing to establish its claim. Finally, the conclusions drawn from these premises are either unsupported or hedged in such a way that suggests the author's lack of confidence in their validity. Let's look at the structure of the argument. The first three premises are trivially true and do nothing to establish the validity or soundness of the argument. They could be removed entirely and the structure wouldn't change, thereby proving that they were never necessary to begin with. Their inclusion is just decorative filler that gives the illusion of a more rigorous argument, but these premises don't actually contribute anything meaningful to the argument's reasoning. Moving on to the fourth premise, beliefs are propositional states that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. The most obviously contentious point of the premise is the language, manifest in reality. It suggests that beliefs have an independent reality outside of cognition. A Platonic idealism, where beliefs are conjured from an alternative realm of ideals. To offer a bit of charity, we might rephrase the premise as beliefs are propositional states that correlate with certain neural activities. However, taking the premise as stated, it assumes a physicalist, internalist view of belief without argument, ignoring alternative theories such as content externalism, which argues that beliefs are partly determined by external factors, not just internal neural activity. The stated quote is an interesting thought experiment that Schwitzgebel uses to describe the division between two different schools of philosophical thought. The internalists who would accept the position, and externalists who would reject it. Schwitzgebel here isn't presenting this thought experiment as a matter of fact, but a point of consideration. The author doesn't supply a justification for accepting the internalist over the externalist position on the matter. To illustrate, the externalist may respond with Putnam's twin Earth. Imagine Earth and twin Earth, where everything is identical except that twin Earth's water, twater, is made of a different chemical composition, XYZ instead of HO. An earthling and a twin earthling both call the clear, drinkable liquid water. Internally, their brains are identical, yet their beliefs differ. The earthling believes water is H2O. The twin earthling believes water is XYZ. Since their neural states are the same, but their beliefs are different, this shows that beliefs are not just in the head, they depend on the external world. As it stands, premise 4 is philosophically contentious and unjustified. I am offered no motivation to accept it. It is important to understand that belief is considered an abstract conceptual phenomena, not a concrete physical phenomena. It would be a mistake to assume that conceptual distinctions require distinct physical instantiations. To do so would risk reifying concepts in a philosophically naive manner. Having exhaustively covered premise 4, we move on to the first conclusion. Therefore, if the neural activity that constitutes non-belief is the same as the neural activity that constitutes disbelief, then these doxastic positions are the same. Even if I accepted premise 4's internalist perspective, this conclusion depends on premise 4 establishing identity, which it fails to do. The phrase beliefs are propositional states that manifest as corresponding neural activity only establishes a correlation between beliefs and neural activity, not an identity. To establish identity, it would need to state something like, beliefs are nothing more than neural activity, or beliefs are strictly reducible to neural states. Even if I accepted premise 4 and it established identity, the first conclusion is still a conditional. This is a weak and uninformative conclusion that does no real work. Moving on, premise 5 states, the neural activity that constitutes non-belief is indistinguishable from the neural activity that constitutes disbelief. This contradicts premise 4, which asserts that beliefs manifest as neural activity, implying that different beliefs should correspond to distinct neural patterns. However, premise 5 claims that no distinction can be found between non-belief and disbelief. This undermines the assumption that beliefs reliably manifest as distinct neural states. If premise 4 is true, we should be able to identify neural activity corresponding to different doxastic states, allowing us to distinguish them from each other. If premise 4 is true, then premise 5 is false. Or if premise 5 is true, then premise 4 is false. This contradiction might be understood in the light that premise 4 and the following first conclusion are ontological in nature, whereas premise 5 and the following second conclusion are epistemic in nature. Premise 4 assumes a distinction in the nature of belief, while premise 5 claims no empirical method exists to distinguish these states. This shift between ontological and epistemic claims without proper linkage renders the argument unsound. The premise as well sets up an unreasonable burden of proof by requiring a concrete neurological distinction to validate an abstract conceptual distinction. Many mental states that we readily distinguish, such as confusion, apathy, love, or dread, might not have clear-cut neural signatures, yet they are meaningfully different in everyday reasoning. By treating the conceptual distinction between non-belief and disbelief as if it must correspond to a physical neural distinction, the author commits their own reification fallacy. Conceptual categories do not need a one-to-one correlation with brain activity to be meaningful. For example, running and jogging might involve similar neural activity, but that does not mean the distinction is invalid or meaningless. The conceptual distinction remains. And that is more than enough of a difference for abstract concepts. Non-belief, lacking belief, and disbelief, holding the belief that a proposition is false, are widely recognized as distinct cognitive states. The supposed lack of neurological distinction doesn't erase the functional and philosophical difference between the two. Finally, in their study Functional Neuroimaging of Belief, Disbelief, and Uncertainty, Harris et al. Utilized functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to investigate the neural correlates of these cognitive states. The results of this study, that belief, disbelief, and uncertainty are distinguishable at the neural level, directly challenges premise 5. Since premise 5 is unsupported and contradicts premise 4, I cannot accept either premise until these issues are sufficiently resolved. Looking at the argument's structure leading into the second conclusion, it would seem as if conclusion 1, premise 5, and conclusion 2 are in the form of a classic modus ponens. However, the shift from the ontological to the epistemic disrupts the logical form. Instead of affirming these doxastic positions are the same, the identity claim, or these doxastic positions are indistinguishable, the epistemic claim, it hedges by asserting, it is reasonable to conclude that these are the same doxastic position. For conclusion 2 to logically follow, there would need to be a clear connection between epistemic and ontological claims. By hedging its claims, it introduces a level of uncertainty unwarranted by previous premises. It suggests that the author lacks confidence in the argument's validity but still wants to persuade the reader. This is just small proposition P energy. In summary, the argument is flawed and can be dismissed. Premise 4 is contentious, while premise 5 directly contradicts it and lacks empirical support. The conclusions are neither logically derived from the premises nor compelling in any meaningful way. Rhetorical hedging is used to mask the argument's inadequacies, but it only highlights its small proposition P energy. Finally, it reifies the abstract, and shifts between ontological identity claims and epistemic claims. In the end, the argument makes a number of dubious claims while subtly suggesting the reader share the author's mistake.